On the afternoon of August 18th, 1979, in front of 2,147 people at the Buchanan County Fair in Independence, Iowa, a man named Dale Pressler made the most expensive mistake of his life. He bet $10,000 cash right there in front of everyone that his brand new John Deere 4440 would beat his neighbor's rusty Farmall 560 in the tractor pull finals. The Farmall hadn't been washed in a decade. Its red paint had faded to something closer to dried blood. There was a dent in the hood from where a hay bale had fallen on it in 1972, and the left rear fender was held on with baling wire. Dale Pressler took one look at that tractor and laughed so hard he nearly choked on his cigarette. $10,000, he announced, loud enough for half the grandstand to hear. $10,000, says that piece of junkyard scrap doesn't make it halfway down the track. The man standing next to the Farmall was named Eugene Holtz. He was 44 years old, and he hadn't raised his voice in public since his wedding day. He looked at Dale Pressler, looked at the money Dale was waving in the air, and said 4 words that would be repeated in that county for the next 40 years. "I'll take that bet." The crowd went silent. Then someone in the grandstand started laughing. Then someone else. Within 30 seconds, 2,000 people were looking at Eugene Holtz like he'd lost his mind. And maybe he had, because on paper, this wasn't even a contest. Dale Pressler's John Deere 4440 was the most advanced tractor money could buy in 1979. Brand new, straight from the dealership in Waterloo, with a turbocharged 466 cubic inch diesel engine putting out over 130 horsepower. It had power shift transmission, factory air conditioning, and a sound-dampened cab that cost more than most farmers made in a year. The sticker price was somewhere north of $45,000. Eugene's Farmall 560 was 18 years old. It had a naturally aspirated 6-cylinder engine that put out maybe 60 horsepower on a good day. He'd bought it used in 1967 for $2,800. By 1979, it had logged over 9,000 hours of hard work across his 280-acre operation. It was, by any reasonable measure, exactly what Dale Pressler called it, junkyard scrap. But there was something Dale didn't know about that tractor, something Eugene had never told anyone. And in about 15 minutes, the whole county was going to find out. Let me stop here and tell you about these 2 men, because this story isn't really about tractors. It's about pride. It's about what happens when a man with money mistakes wealth for worth. Dale Pressler came from what people in Buchanan County called old money, which in Iowa farming terms meant his grandfather had bought 800 acres during the Depression for pennies on the dollar. By 1979, the Pressler family owned over 2,200 acres of prime northeast Iowa farmland, and Dale had spent most of his adult life making sure everyone knew it. He drove a new truck every 2 years. He wore boots that cost more than most farmers' church suits. He sat on the county board, the co-op board, and the church finance committee, not because he cared about any of those things, but because he liked seeing his name on plaques. Every time a neighbor struggled, every time a farm went up for auction, Dale Pressler was there with his checkbook and his smile, picking up the pieces at a discount. Eugene Holtz was different. His family had come to Iowa in 1919, refugees from a failed homestead in Nebraska. His grandfather had worked as a hired hand for 15 years before saving enough to buy 160 acres of his own. Eugene's father had expanded that to 280 acres by the time he died in 1965, leaving everything to his only son. Eugene had spent the last 14 years doing exactly what his father and grandfather had done. Working the land, paying his bills, keeping his head down. He didn't sit on any boards. He didn't go to many meetings. He spent most of his time in the barn or the fields. His Farmall 560 was the first tractor his father had let him drive back in 1962. He'd learned to plow on that machine, learned to cultivate, learned to understand what an engine was telling you by the sound it made and the way it pulled. When his father died, Eugene kept the Farmall running, not because he couldn't afford something newer, but because that tractor knew his land better than he did. And there was one other thing about that Farmall, one secret that Eugene had discovered by accident in the winter of 1971 when he pulled the engine apart to replace a cracked head gasket. but I'll get to that. First, let me tell you about the moment everything changed. The Buchanan County Fair tractor pull had been a tradition since the 50s. Farmers came from 3 counties to compete, and the grandstands were always full. The rules were simple. Each tractor pulled a weighted sled down a 300-foot track. The sled transferred weight forward as it moved, making it progressively harder to pull. Whoever pulled the sled the farthest won. A full pull moved you to the next round with added weight. Eugene hadn't entered the tractor pull in years. He used to compete in the late 60s when his father was alive, but after the old man died, Eugene lost interest in most things that weren't directly related to keeping the farm running. So when he showed up at the registration table on the morning of August 18th, people were surprised. When they saw what he was planning to compete with, they were confused. Eugene said the registration clerk, a woman named Dorothy who'd known him since grade school, "You know this is the open class, right? You're going up against some serious iron." Eugene nodded. "I know. That Farmall's got to be, 18 years old? 18. She runs fine." Dorothy looked past him at the Farmall, parked in the staging area with rust streaks down its hood and an exhaust stack that was more black carbon than metal. She looked back at Eugene with something like pity. "Well," she said, "it's your entry fee." Eugene paid the $25 and went to wait with the other competitors. Dale Pressler had won the Buchanan County tractor pull 3 years running, 1976, 77, and 78. His John Deere 4330 had been dominant, and this year he'd upgraded to the even more powerful 4440. He fully expected to make it 4 in a row. When he saw Eugene's name on the competitor list, he thought it was a joke. When he walked over to the staging area and saw the Farmall, he knew it was real. "Eugene Holtz," Dale said, loud enough for the dozen other competitors to hear. "I didn't know they were letting museum pieces compete this year." A few men laughed. Eugene didn't say anything. Dale walked around the Farmall slowly, making a show of examining it. He kicked one of the tires, shook his head. "You know what this tractor's worth, Eugene? About $150, and that's if you sold it for scrap." Then he turned back to Eugene with a grin. "I'll make you a deal. I'll give you $500 for that tractor right now. Cash. You can walk away. Save yourself the embarrassment." Eugene looked at Dale for a long moment. His face was impossible to read. "Not for sale," he said. Dale laughed. "Not for sale. In about 2 hours, that thing isn't going to be worth the diesel in its tank." Eugene shrugged. "We'll see." The tractor pull started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The open class was scheduled for 4:30 after the lighter divisions had finished. By the time the big tractors lined up, the grandstands were full and the August heat had everyone sweating through their shirts. 15 tractors were competing. Dale's 4440 was the clear favorite, but there were other serious machines. A couple of case tractors, an International 1466, a Massey Ferguson modified for competition. Eugene's Farmall 560 was the oldest tractor in the lineup by at least a decade. It was also the smallest. Eugene drew 8th position. Dale drew 12th. The first 7 tractors pulled distances ranging from 187 feet to the full 300. The International 1466 got a full pull, and so did one of the case tractors. The crowd was enjoying itself, cheering the good pulls, groaning at the ones that fell short. Then it was Eugene's turn. He climbed up onto the Farmall and started the engine. It caught on the first try, a deep, healthy rumble that surprised a few people in the crowd. Eugene let it warm up for a minute, then pulled forward to hook up to the sled. The track judge gave the signal. Eugene eased the clutch out. The Farmall moved forward, pulling the sled behind it. For the first 100 feet, it looked like any other pull. The tractor straining, the sled getting heavier, the engine working harder. At 150 feet, a few people started paying closer attention. At 200 feet, the crowd was getting interested. At 250 feet, people were standing up. The Farmall's engine was screaming now, sound that seemed too big to be coming from such an old machine. The exhaust stack was shooting black smoke. The rear tires were digging into the dirt, throwing up rooster tails of soil. 275 feet, 290 feet. The Farmall crossed the 300-foot line with the sled still moving, full pull. Crowd exploded. People were cheering, clapping, looking at each other in disbelief. Eugene's Farmall 560 had just posted a full pull in the open class. Eugene drove back to the staging area like nothing unusual had happened. He shut off the engine, climbed down, and walked over to the water cooler without looking at anyone. Dale Pressler was standing 20 feet away, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, he wasn't smiling. Now I need to stop here and tell you something important, something that explains what happened on that track. The Farmall 560 came from the factory with a 263 cubic inch six-cylinder engine rated at about 60 horsepower. Good, reliable tractor, nothing special. But Eugene's Farmall wasn't stock. When he'd pulled the head off that engine in 1971 to replace a cracked head gasket, he found something that didn't match any spec sheet he'd ever seen. The cylinders were bored out. The pistons were different, heavier, with a higher compression ratio. The camshaft had a profile he didn't recognize. Someone had done serious work to this engine. Eugene did some research, made some phone calls. Eventually, he found the answer. His Farmall had been a factory test mule. Back in 1962, International Harvester was developing what would become the Farmall 706, a bigger, more powerful tractor to replace the 560 series. To test their new designs, they modified a batch of 560s with prototype components. Most of those test mules were scrapped after testing was done, but one had ended up at a dealership in Cedar Rapids, where it was sold as a standard used 560 in 1967 to Eugene's father. The modifications boosted the engine output from 60 horsepower to something closer to 85 or 90. Not enough to win against a new 444 in normal conditions, but a lot more tractor than it looked like. Eugene's father had never known. He just thought he'd bought a tractor that ran exceptionally well. Eugene had figured it out and never told anyone. There was no reason to. Until August 18th, 1979, when Dale Pressler bet $10,000 against it. The final started at 5:30 in the afternoon, the sun getting low, shadows stretching long across the track. 8 tractors had made the cut, both Case machines, the International, the Massey Ferguson, Dale's John Deere, and Eugene's Farmall. The finals added 2,000 pounds to the sled. The first 4 tractors pulled respectable distances: 235 feet, 251 feet, 247 feet, 268 feet. Then it was Eugene's turn. This time the crowd was paying attention from the start. The Farmall hooked up to the sled. Eugene gave it throttle. The engine roared, that same deep, surprising sound. At 200 feet, the sled was getting heavy. At 250 feet, the tires were spinning, grabbing, spinning again. At 275 feet, it looked like the tractor was going to stall. But Eugene knew his machine. He'd been driving it for 17 years. He knew exactly how much power it had, exactly when to shift his weight, exactly how to keep the wheels gripping. 287 feet. The Farmall finally stopped, engine straining, tires smoking. It wasn't a full pull, but 287 feet was the best distance of the finals so far. Dale Pressler was up next. He climbed into his John Deere with the confidence of a man who'd already won. The 4440 started with a smooth, powerful rumble. Dale pulled up to the sled, hooked on, and waited for the signal. The flag dropped. Dale hit the throttle. 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet, 260 feet. At 278 feet, Dale's rear tires lost traction. He tried to recover, shifted his weight, adjusted the throttle. The sled had stopped moving. The John Deere was spinning its wheels in place, going nowhere. 278 feet, 9 feet short of Eugene's mark. For a moment, nobody made a sound. Then the crowd started to murmur, then to talk, then to shout. People were pointing at the scoreboard, pointing at the Farmall, pointing at Dale's face. Dale Pressler sat in his $45,000 John Deere, staring straight ahead as the realization sank in. He had lost. The remaining 2 tractors both failed to beat Eugene's distance. When the announcer called the final results, Eugene Holtz and his 1961 Farmall 560 had won the Buchanan County Fair Open Class Tractor Pull. First place prize, $500 and a trophy. But Eugene had already won something worth more than that. He walked over to where Dale Pressler was standing, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I'll take that $10,000 now," he said quietly. The crowd was watching. Everyone was watching. Dale Pressler, who had laughed so hard he nearly choked, who had called Eugene's tractor junkyard scrap, who had announced his bet loud enough for half the grandstand to hear, now had to pay up in front of all of them. Dale's face went red, his jaw tightened, but there were too many witnesses. Too many people who had heard him make the bet. Too many people watching now to see what kind of man he really was. Dale reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote a check for $10,000. He handed it to Eugene without looking at him. Eugene took the check, folded it, put it in his pocket. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He just nodded once, turned around, and walked back to his tractor. That night, Eugene Holtz became a legend in Buchanan County, and Dale Pressler's reputation, the one he'd spent 30 years building, started its long, slow collapse. Dale didn't take the loss well. He'd been humiliated in front of 2,000 people. Within a month, he'd become a punchline. "Hey, Dale, you want to bet on that?" people would say, grinning. Dale stopped going to the diner, stopped going to the co-op meetings, and then, 2 months after the tractor pull, Dale Pressler bought another 400 acres of land. He paid top dollar, $2,600 an acre, financed entirely through the bank. He was trying to prove something, show everyone he was still the biggest, the richest, the most successful farmer in the county. It was the worst possible decision at the worst possible time. The 1980s farm crisis had already begun. Interest rates climbed into the high teens. Land values collapsed, grain prices fell. By 1982, Dale Pressler owed the bank nearly $800,000, and his collateral was worth maybe half that. Eugene Holtz had no debt at all. His father had paid off the last of the family's loans in 1950. Eugene had never borrowed a dime. The $10,000 he'd won went straight into a savings account. He said later it didn't feel like his money. It felt like a lesson he was supposed to keep. By 1985, Dale was facing foreclosure. The auction was scheduled for March 15th. 3 days before the auction, Eugene Holtz drove up the long driveway to the Pressler farmhouse. Dale's wife, Martha, answered the door, eyes red from weeks of crying. "Eugene," she said, "Dale's not seeing anyone right now." "I know," Eugene said, "just for a minute." Dale was sitting in the living room staring at the wall. When he saw Eugene, something flickered across his face. Shame, anger, resignation. "Come to gloat," he said. Eugene shook his head, came to talk. He sat down across from Dale, took off his cap, and held it in his hands. "I've got a proposition," Eugene said. "I'll pay off your bank loan, all of it. In exchange, you deed me 600 acres, the original Pressler land, the stuff your grandfather bought." Dale stared. "That's half the farm, I know. That's $380,000 according to the bank. I talked to them yesterday." "Why?" Dale finally asked. "Why would you do that?" Eugene was quiet for a moment. "Because my father taught me that a man's not measured by what he takes. He's measured by what he gives back. That day at the fair, it was never about the money. It was about respect. You treated me like I was nothing, like 50 years of my family's work didn't matter because I didn't have a new John Deere. I wanted you to see that you were wrong. That's all. I didn't want to destroy you. I didn't want your children to lose their home." Dale's eyes were wet. "And if I say yes, what then? Then you keep farming. You got 1,600 acres left, the buildings, the equipment. That's enough if you're careful. If you stop trying to be the biggest and start trying to be the smartest." Eugene stood and put his cap back on. "You've got until tomorrow morning. After that, I'm buying at the auction, and I won't be offering to leave you anything." He walked out without waiting for an answer. Dale Pressler said yes. The deal closed 3 days before the scheduled auction. Eugene paid the bank $380,000, and Dale signed over 600 acres. The man who'd laughed at the junkyard Farmall was now in debt to the man who drove it. The man who'd owned 2,200 acres now owned 1,600, but he still had a farm. His children still had a home. Slowly, over the years that followed, Dale Pressler started to become a different kind of man. He sold the John Deere 4440 in 1987 and bought a used International that was 10 years old but ran fine. He stopped going to the dealership showroom. He started going to Eugene Holtz's barn to learn how to fix old equipment instead. The two men never became friends exactly, But they became neighbors who respected each other, who helped each other during planting and harvest, who nodded at the feed store without any need for words. In 1994, 15 years after the tractor pull, Dale Pressler suffered a heart attack in his north field. Eugene found him. He'd been driving past on his way to town, saw Dale's tractor stopped in the middle of the field, and went to check. He called the ambulance, sat with Dale in the dirt, kept him calm until the paramedics arrived. Dale survived, but the doctor said he couldn't farm anymore. A month later, Dale came to Eugene with another proposition. He wanted to sell the remaining 1,600 acres. He wanted Eugene to buy them. Anyone else would split it up, Dale said, sell it off piece by piece to the highest bidders, but you'd keep it together. You'd farm it right. Eugene thought about it for 3 days. Then he said yes. He paid a fair price. Not a discount, not top dollar, just what the land was worth. And when the papers were signed, he gave 400 acres to Dale's oldest son, Michael. Free and clear. No payment, no strings. Your grandfather built something here, Eugene told him. Your father almost lost it, but that doesn't mean your family has to leave. This land knows your name. Eugene Holtz died in 2012 at the age of 77. He'd farmed his land until he was 75 when his own son took over. The Farmall 560 is still in the family barn. Eugene's grandson restored it a few years ago, stripped it to bare metal, and built it back up. It runs better now than it did in 1979. Every August during the county fair, they bring it out and park it near the tractor pull track. There's a small sign next to it that tells the story, the bet, the pull, the upset that nobody expected. People stop and read the sign. They look at the tractor, they shake their heads and smile. Hard to believe, they say. That rusty old thing beat a brand new John Deere. But if you look closely at that Farmall, if you know where to look, you can still see the faint outline of a number stamped into the engine block. A test mule designation from 1962 when some engineer at International Harvester decided to see how much power they could get out of a 560 frame. They got enough, more than enough. And more than 40 years later, that tractor is still teaching the same lesson it taught Dale Pressler on a hot August afternoon in Iowa. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't bet against people you've underestimated. And never assume that what you see on the outside tells you anything about what's underneath. The rust doesn't matter. The dents don't matter. The baling wire doesn't matter. What matters is what's in the heart of the machine and what's in the heart of the man who drives it.